Investigators now believe a crucial clue in the Nancy Guthrie case may have been found inside a car connected to her own son-in-law, and what the FBI reportedly saw inside that vehicle raised questions detectives are still trying to answer. Nancy Guthrie disappeared in the middle of the night. A masked figure appeared on her porch. Blood was found outside her front door. But now investigators believe the real story of that night may not only be hidden inside Nancy Guthrie's house, it may also be connected to evidence discovered inside that car. Before we go any further, subscribe and turn on notifications, because once you see the timeline, detectives are now re-examining. And the evidence connected to that vehicle, the Nancy Guthrie case begins to look very different from what people first believed. Because somewhere between the moment Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera was removed and the moment her pacemaker suddenly stopped transmitting, something happened that investigators are still trying to understand, and the answer to that mystery may now be connected to someone very close to Nancy Guthrie's life, her own son-in-law. When investigators first arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home, they believed they were responding to a possible kidnapping. But what detectives discovered outside the front door immediately changed the tone of the investigation: blood. Small droplets scattered across the porch near the entrance of the house. At first glance, the stains did not appear large, but forensic investigators know that even a small amount of blood can reveal critical information about what happened during a crime. Samples were carefully collected and sent for laboratory testing. The results confirmed something investigators feared: the blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. Forensic specialists then examined photographs of the droplets in detail. The shape of the stains suggested they had fallen from above rather than being dragged across the surface. That pattern often appears when blood drops from a person's face or mouth during a struggle. In other words, Nancy Guthrie had likely been injured outside her own front door. That discovery raised serious questions for detectives, because kidnappers who want ransom money usually try to avoid harming the victim. An injured victim makes negotiations more difficult and increases the risk of the crime becoming far more serious. But the evidence on Nancy Guthrie's porch suggested something different. Something may have gone wrong almost immediately. Investigators began considering a disturbing possibility. What if the person responsible never intended for the situation to become violent? And what if the events that followed, the ransom messages, the public attention, the mysterious silence, were not part of the original plan at all? Because if a struggle happened at that door, the crime may have changed direction in a matter of seconds. And if that happened, the person responsible may have been forced to improvise what happened next. From the very beginning of the investigation, detectives focused heavily on one piece of information: the timeline. Because digital devices rarely lie. Security cameras record exact moments. Medical devices record exact signals. And when investigators combined those records, they discovered something that quickly became the center of the case: a 41-minute gap. At 1:47 a.m., Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera suddenly went offline. Not because the internet connection dropped, not because the system malfunctioned, but because someone physically removed the camera from the wall. Later, when investigators recovered fragments of the footage, they saw a disturbing image: a person standing on the porch wearing a ski mask and gloves. Whoever approached the house that night had come prepared, but that was only the beginning. Exactly 41 minutes later, another signal stopped transmitting: Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker. At 2:28 a.m., the wireless connection between the pacemaker and the monitoring device connected to her phone suddenly disappeared. For investigators, that moment immediately became one of the most important timestamps in the case, because pacemakers normally send regular signals to monitoring systems. When that signal disappears suddenly, it usually means one of two things: either the patient moved far enough away from the monitoring device, or something happened to the patient themselves. Which meant one thing was certain: whatever happened at Nancy Guthrie's home that night, it was already over by 2:28 a.m., and everything investigators believe happened inside that house happened during those 41 minutes. But detectives are now asking another question: if something went wrong during that confrontation on the porch, where did the suspect go next? Because the answer to that question may lead directly to the piece of evidence investigators are now studying most closely: a car connected to Nancy Guthrie's own son-in-law. As investigators continued examining the evidence inside Nancy Guthrie's home, their attention slowly expanded beyond the house itself. Because in many disappearance cases, the crime scene doesn't end where the victim was last seen. Sometimes it continues somewhere else, a road, a vehicle, or a place investigators have not yet discovered. That is why detectives began examining vehicles connected to the people closest to Nancy Guthrie's life. Among those vehicles was one belonging to Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law. For investigators, searching a vehicle connected to family members is not unusual. In fact, it is a standard step in many investigations. Detectives routinely examine cars belonging to relatives, friends, and neighbors to rule out possible connections to a crime. Vehicles can contain important clues, fibers, trace evidence, objects that may have been moved, or signs that something unusual happened inside the vehicle. Investigators are trained to notice even the smallest details, and according to reports connected to the case, the vehicle belonging to Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law became something detectives wanted to examine carefully. From the outside, it might appear like a routine investigative step, but detectives rarely spend time examining something unless they believe it might answer an important question. Because if someone involved in the events of that night left Nancy Guthrie's home in a vehicle, that car could potentially contain evidence explaining what happened after the struggle investigators believe occurred on the porch. Evidence about movement, evidence about timing, and possibly evidence connected to what happened to Nancy Guthrie after that door opened, which is why investigators began looking closely at every detail connected to that vehicle. Because in cases like this, the smallest clue inside a car can sometimes reveal far more than investigators expected. One of the most common misconceptions about major investigations is that the suspect is usually a stranger. But experienced detectives know something very different. Most serious crimes involve someone who already knows the victim, someone familiar with their routine, someone who understands when they are likely to be alone, and someone who knows the layout of their home. That is why investigators almost always begin by examining the people closest to the victim's life. Family members, friends, neighbors, anyone who had regular contact with the victim. Not because detectives assume those people are guilty, but because they often know details outsiders do not. Nancy Guthrie lived a quiet and predictable life. At 84 years old, her daily routine rarely changed. She returned home at similar times, she lived alone, and she relied on medical devices to monitor her health. Someone familiar with Nancy Guthrie's life would likely know these details. They would know when the house would be quiet. They would know when Nancy would likely be alone, and they would know exactly where the security camera was mounted outside the front door. That last detail continued to trouble investigators because the masked figure seen in the recovered footage did not search for the camera. They walked directly toward it, covered it, and removed it. That kind of confidence often suggests familiarity. Familiarity with the house, familiarity with the property, and possibly familiarity with Nancy Guthrie's life itself, which is why detectives continue examining every connection surrounding the case, because somewhere inside those connections may be the detail that finally explains what happened during the 41 minutes the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Shortly after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, another piece of the story began to unfold. Ransom messages. In most kidnapping cases, the person responsible contacts the family directly. They establish communication, provide instructions for payment, and most importantly, prove that the victim is still alive. Because kidnappers who want money rely on one thing above all else: leverage. But in the Nancy Guthrie case, something unusual happened. The ransom messages were not sent to the family. They were sent to the media. Television stations and news organizations received messages demanding millions of dollars in cryptocurrency. At first, the demand appeared dramatic and frightening, but when investigators studied the messages more closely, they noticed something strange. There was no way for the family to respond, no phone number, no email address, no instructions explaining how the ransom could actually be delivered. In other words, the messages created the appearance of a kidnapping, without allowing any negotiation to take place. For experienced detectives, that detail immediately raised questions, because kidnappers who truly want money usually maintain communication with the family. They remind the family that the victim is alive and push them toward payment. Silence works against them. But after the ransom messages appeared in the Nancy Guthrie case, communication almost completely stopped. No photos of Nancy Guthrie, no voice recordings, no proof that she was alive. That absence of proof troubled investigators, because if someone had truly taken Nancy Guthrie and wanted millions of dollars, providing proof of life would have been the easiest way to pressure the family. But that never happened, which forced detectives to consider a disturbing possibility. What if the ransom messages were never meant to lead to money? What if they were meant to lead investigators somewhere else, because creating the illusion of a kidnapping would immediately shift attention toward an unknown criminal, a mysterious stranger who appeared in the night and vanished without a trace? And if investigators focused on that unknown suspect, they might spend weeks searching in the wrong direction, while the real answers remained much closer to Nancy Guthrie's life. As the investigation continued, detectives began reviewing every statement connected to the case, family interviews, public appearances, and conversations investigators had privately with people close to Nancy Guthrie. In complicated cases, statements matter, because detectives often compare what people say with the timeline created by physical evidence. Most of the time, those details match. But occasionally, investigators notice something different, a small difference in timing, a detail that does not perfectly match the digital record, or a description that raises new questions. In the Nancy Guthrie investigation, detectives reportedly began examining statements connected to Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law. From the beginning, he had remained largely outside the public spotlight. While other family members spoke publicly asking for help, investigators were quietly documenting every detail connected to the night Nancy disappeared. Recently, one statement connected to the timeline of that night drew investigators' attention. On its own, the statement may not have seemed unusual, but when detectives compared that description with the digital evidence already collected from Nancy Guthrie's home, something caught their attention. The times did not perfectly match. The difference was small, but in investigations like this, even small differences can matter, because digital evidence rarely makes mistakes. Security systems record exact timestamps, medical devices record exact signals, and when those records do not align perfectly with someone's recollection of events, detectives begin asking additional questions. Investigators are now reportedly reviewing that timeline carefully. The camera removal at 1:47 a.m., the pacemaker signal ending at 2:28 a.m., and the events that may have happened during those 41 minutes. Because somewhere inside that timeline may be the key to understanding what really happened, the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. As detectives continued studying the evidence, one question refused to go away: how did the person responsible leave the scene? In most investigations, the escape creates a trail. A vehicle appears on nearby cameras, a neighbor hears an engine. Traffic cameras record headlights moving through intersections. But in the Nancy Guthrie case, that trail appeared strangely quiet. Investigators collected surveillance footage from homes across the surrounding neighborhood. Doorbell cameras, driveway cameras, traffic cameras from nearby roads. They examined hours of footage from the night Nancy disappeared, yet none of those recordings clearly showed a vehicle connected to the crime leaving the area at the time investigators believed Nancy vanished. For detectives, that silence created an unsettling possibility. If the suspect did not leave in a vehicle captured by cameras, then how did they leave? One possibility was that the suspect walked away from the property, moving through darker areas of the neighborhood where cameras were limited. Another possibility was that someone else may have been waiting farther away, but investigators also considered something else. What if the plan for leaving the house changed suddenly? If a confrontation occurred on the porch, the same confrontation that may have caused the blood investigators found outside Nancy Guthrie's door, the situation may have become unpredictable in seconds. And when plans change unexpectedly, people make mistakes. Mistakes that investigators sometimes discover weeks or even months later, which is why detectives began looking closely at movement patterns connected to the night Nancy disappeared. Who was traveling near the area? Which vehicles were active nearby? And whether any cars connected to people in Nancy Guthrie's life showed unusual movement during that time. Because if someone involved in the events of that night left the house by vehicle, detectives believe that movement may eventually reveal itself somewhere in the digital trail. By this stage of the investigation, detectives had already collected a significant amount of evidence: forensic samples from the porch, digital data from Nancy Guthrie's medical device, fragments of footage recovered from the doorbell camera, and statements from people who had contact with Nancy in the hours before she disappeared. But experienced investigators know something important about complex cases. Sometimes the answer is not hidden in new evidence. Sometimes it is hidden in evidence detectives already have, waiting for one small detail to make everything clear. In the Nancy Guthrie investigation, detectives began re-examining connections between the timeline, the physical evidence at the house, and the vehicles connected to people close to Nancy's life. Because if someone left the scene in a car after the confrontation investigators believe happened on the porch, that vehicle could hold important clues, movement records, trace evidence, or signs that something unusual happened inside the car that night. Investigators have not publicly revealed what they may have found during their examination, but detectives rarely focus on something without a reason, which is why the vehicle connected to Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law continues to be discussed as part of the broader investigation, not as a conclusion, but as a question investigators are still trying to answer. Because in a case where so many details remain unexplained, even the smallest clue can change how detectives understand the events of that night. And sometimes, the clue that finally reveals the truth is hidden somewhere investigators were not originally expecting to look. Even as investigators examined vehicles, statements, and forensic evidence, one part of the case continued to dominate the investigation: the timeline. Because in complex cases like this, detectives often say that timelines do not lie. Phones, cameras, and medical devices record events down to the exact second. And in the Nancy Guthrie investigation, every piece of digital evidence leads back to the same narrow window of time: 41 minutes. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera outside Nancy Guthrie's home was physically removed from the wall. Fragments of the recovered footage showed a masked individual standing on the porch moments before the device went dark. Then, exactly 41 minutes later, another signal suddenly stopped: Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker. At 2:28 a.m., the wireless connection between the pacemaker and the monitoring device connected to her phone disappeared. For investigators, that moment became one of the most important timestamps in the entire case. Because pacemakers normally transmit signals continuously. When that signal disappears suddenly, it usually means one of two things. Either the patient moved far enough away from the monitoring device that the signal could no longer connect, or something happened to the patient themselves. That meant one thing was certain: whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie had already occurred by 2:28 a.m. Everything investigators believe happened that night: the confrontation on the porch, the injury that left blood outside the door, and Nancy Guthrie's disappearance took place inside that 41-minute window. And detectives believe that somewhere within those minutes lies the explanation for everything that followed. Today, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie remains one of the most unsettling mysteries investigators are still trying to solve. An elderly woman vanishes from her home in the middle of the night. A masked figure appears briefly on a doorbell camera, the device is removed, a pacemaker signal suddenly stops transmitting, and blood belonging to Nancy Guthrie is found outside her front door. Each piece of evidence reveals part of the story. But when investigators place those pieces together, the full picture of what happened that night still remains incomplete. Detectives continue studying the same question that has followed the case since the beginning: what happened during those 41 minutes? Somewhere between the moment the doorbell camera was removed and the moment Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker stopped transmitting, investigators believe the truth about that night unfolded. Whether that truth is hidden in digital records, forensic evidence, or something investigators discovered while examining vehicles connected to the case, detectives believe the answer exists. Because crimes rarely disappear without leaving something behind: a detail, a mistake, or a piece of evidence that eventually reveals exactly what happened. Until that moment arrives, the Nancy Guthrie investigation remains open, and somewhere out there someone still knows the truth about what happened the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared.